The man smiled, oblivious. He didn't see her watching. He was lost in his own world, a world she craved to enter. Sarah's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her fingers tightened around the binoculars, the cold metal biting into her skin. He was beautiful. His laugh, a melody that echoed in the stillness of her apartment. He was hers, he just didn't know it yet. Sarah lowered the binoculars, her breath fogging the window pane. The streetlight cast an orange glow on the opposite building, illuminating his window like a stage. She imagined him there, laughing, living, loving. A bitter envy twisted in her gut. She wanted that life, that happiness. She wanted it with him. Sarah lived a life of quiet desperation. Days bled into nights, a monotonous cycle of work, frozen dinners, and television static. Her small apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its silence a constant reminder of her isolation. She yearned for connection, for someone to chase away the shadows that clung to the edges of her life. Friendships had always been difficult. She was too intense, too invested, too quick to scare people away with the ferocity of her emotions. Men, too, seemed intimidated by her, put off by her quiet intensity and the way her eyes seemed to see too much. Then he moved in across the street. David. He was like a burst of sunlight in her monochrome world, his laughter a symphony that shattered the silence of her days. He became her anchor, a fixed point in the vast emptiness of her life. His name was David. She discovered it by accident, overhearing a conversation in the building's elevator. David. The name rolled off her tongue like a prayer, a whispered promise of something more. She began to collect tiny scraps of information about him. His job, his favorite coffee shop, the name of his dog, a scruffy terrier named Buster. Each detail, no matter how insignificant, was a precious jewel to be hoarded, a piece of the puzzle that was David. One rainy Tuesday evening, she saw him in the local grocery store. He was wearing a worn leather jacket, his hair damp and tousled, his smile dazzling as he chatted with the cashier. Sarah froze, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. He was even more captivating up close. She wanted to talk to him, to hear the sound of his voice directed at her, to see those warm brown eyes light up with recognition. But her courage failed her. He left the store without noticing her, his laughter fading into the night. Sarah started small, leaving a book she knew he'd like on his doorstep, a single red rose tucked inside its pages. The next day, she saw him reading the book on his balcony, a hesitant smile playing on his lips. Her heart soared. He liked her gift. He thought of her, even if he didn't know it. The internet became her weapon, a tool to delve deeper into his life. She found his social media profiles, devouring every photo, every comment, every like. She learned his favorite movies, his taste in music, his childhood dreams. Her apartment became a shrine to him. Photos she printed from his online profiles adorned her walls, his face staring back at her from every angle. Her life, once mundane and predictable, now revolved entirely around him. The line between admiration and obsession blurred, then vanished entirely. Section 5. The Spiral Begins. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. She started following him, her shadow a silent companion on his daily routines. She knew his schedule by heart, the exact time he left for work, the route he took to the park, the cafe where he met his friends on Friday nights. She justified her actions as love, a deep, all-consuming love that transcended boundaries and social norms. Work became a chore, a tedious interruption to her real life, the life she lived in the shadows, watching him, learning him, possessing him from afar. Her friends, those few she had, noticed the change in her. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, now held a distant, unsettling gleam. Her conversations, once filled with laughter and light, became dominated by her obsession. Section 6. Blurred Lines. One night she broke into his apartment. The door was easy to Jimmy, his lock old and worn. Her heart pounded with a heady mix of fear and exhilaration as she stepped inside. His scent enveloped her, a potent aphrodisiac that sent shivers down her spine. She ran her fingers over his furniture, his clothes, his toothbrush. Each touch was a sacrament, a way to commune with him, to possess him in the most intimate way possible. She stayed for hours, exploring every corner of his life, reading his journals, trying on his clothes, lying in his bed, breathing in his scent. She left no trace of her presence, careful to erase her footsteps, to maintain the illusion that she was nothing more than a figment of his imagination. But as she left his apartment that night, the line between reality and fantasy blurred even further. She had tasted his world, touched his life, and she craved more. The next day she watched him from her window, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. Section 7. The walls close in. The police were called. A neighbor had noticed Sarah loitering outside David's apartment building, her behavior agitated, her eyes wild and unfocused. When questioned, she denied everything, her words a jumble of half-truths and outright lies. The officers, sensing her distress but lacking any concrete evidence, could do nothing more than warn her to stay away. Sarah scoffed at their warnings. They were fools, blind to the truth that was so clear to her. They couldn't see the connection, the destiny that bound her to David. She was meant to be his savior, his protector, his everything. They would understand eventually, she thought, once he realized the depth of her love. Section 8. Consumed by darkness. Sleep became her enemy, haunted by disturbing dreams of David, his face contorted in fear, his voice a desperate plea for help. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the line between dreams and reality blurring, the fear seeping into her waking hours, twisting her love into something dark and possessive. She began to see threats everywhere, imaginary rivals vying for David's attention. The friendly barista at his favorite coffee shop, the woman who lived in the apartment above him, even his own dog, Buster, became objects of her jealousy and suspicion. She convinced herself that they were trying to keep them apart, that they were jealous of the special bond she shared with David. Her thoughts spiraled, a vortex of paranoia and delusion. Section 9. The Confrontation. It all came to a head on a stormy Friday night. Sarah, fueled by days of sleep deprivation and paranoia, watched from her window as David left his apartment with another woman. The woman was laughing, her hand resting lightly on David's arm. Rage, raw and primal, surged through Sarah, obliterating all reason, all restraint. They were hers, she thought, her mind a maelstrom of jealousy and possessiveness. She wouldn't let anyone take them away from her. She ran out of her apartment, her bare feet slapping against the wet pavement, the rain stinging her face. She reached David's building just as he and the woman were about to get into a taxi. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "He's mine!" David turned, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. Section 10. Shattered Reality. The police arrived quickly, alerted by the concerned neighbor who had called them once before. Sarah, her rage replaced by a numb despair, offered no resistance as they led her away. She could hear David's voice in the distance, confused, frightened, pleading with the officers to tell him what was going on. But his words seemed to come from a great distance, distorted, unreal. The world around her had fractured, the pieces of her carefully constructed reality shattering into a million sharp shards. She had crossed a line she hadn't even known existed, and there was no going back. As they bundled her into the back of the police car, she caught a glimpse of David's face, his expression a mixture of fear, pity, and something akin to revulsion. And in that moment, the full weight of her actions, the depth of her delusion, crashed down upon her. Section 11. Love's Distorted Echo. The trial was a blur. Sarah, heavily medicated, sat passively as the judge read the charges against her: stalking, harassment, breaking and entering. She pleaded guilty to all counts, her voice a hollow whisper in the crowded courtroom. Her lawyer, a court-appointed public defender, argued for leniency, citing her previously clean record and her deteriorating mental state. But the judge, his face etched with a mixture of pity and disgust, was unmoved. Sarah was sentenced to 2 years in a psychiatric facility, her life as she knew it over. As she was led away, she glanced back at the gallery, her eyes searching for a familiar face. David wasn't there.